this global pandemic and era of social distancing, I spoke with Arthur in our studios in Washington, D.C.
Good to see you.
His graduate courses focus on legal and business matters between China and the United States. He hopes to help the students develop a global business perspective.
In my position at Georgetown University, where I work, we annually take groups of students all over the world, and I, in particular, run our destinations to China and places in Asia. And every time we bring about 45 MBA students to see China, many of whom, the vast majority, have never stepped in China, they always come away from a week-long or two-week experience in China transformed, seeing for themselves and witnessing from themselves exactly the reality of what's going on in China, and having those interactions with Chinese corporate leaders that will give them a very, very different view in terms of what they believe, what their perceptions are, and how China actually works. And so I think it's an invaluable opportunity and experience to encourage all students, if they can, and in universities around the United States, to explore opportunities to engage with China on study opportunities or experiential learning opportunities. And perhaps that's something China can do. Maybe my advice to China's governmental leaders is paying a little more attention to to programs that will, in a sense, encourage larger numbers of American youth and American students to develop learning experiences in China, and therefore exposing them to the realities and enabling them to contrast what they perceive and believe about China and see for themselves what China actually is all about.
You've got a civilization that's been around for thousands of years. You've got a country here that's been around for a couple hundred. It's steeped in history and so many different layers, and yet you probably don't get that just by a short visit.
I completely agree with you, Michael. Those are deep waters. When it comes to placing into context over 2,000 years of continuous civilization, and certainly all the changes that we've seen in China in the past 100 years, it's really, really hard to unpack. To say that you are knowledgeable about China, well, you're just scratching the surface. It goes that deep. And so but any exposure to China outside of what you read in mainstream media, the only way you can really perceive and comprehend China is to go there. Go there, interact with the people, see what on the ground, what actually is going on in China. And without a doubt, even in a short period of time, you're going to want to learn more, but at the same time, you'll come away transformed, and also it'll challenge some of your fundamental assumptions about what China is all about.
Since 2007, Arthur has been a professor in the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He also advises U.S. firms operating in China. I was reading in the first 3 months of 2020, China's direct investment in the U.S. virtually gone. Two-way investment between the U.S. and China falling to a 7-year low. With that in mind, and with the economy racked by COVID-19, doesn't that kind of create some sort of impetus to try and move it in another direction?
I think with regard to the decline in foreign direct investment into the U.S. economy, I think we're going to see continuing momentum in this direction. And it's not because Chinese entities and companies don't have an interest in investing in the United States. It's because of the escalation of policy, the escalation of CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, where U.S. policymakers have made it extremely difficult for any manner of company, not even like a technology company or even companies such as Smithfield Farms, where a Chinese pork producer wanted to buy an American pork producer. Even that deal came under increasing scrutiny. And so we now know with CFIUS 2.0, which is the FIRMA Act, even increased amount of scrutiny on any manner of Chinese investment, plus a lowering of the dollar thresholds, meaning even small investments that amount to even as much as $10,000 are now going to come under scrutiny by the Department of Commerce. It's actually 9 federal agencies, including the CIA, which will have to vet every investment into the United States.
Does that basically shut the door on foreign direct investment?
It certainly has cast a very, very chilling response on the part of Chinese entities, making very difficult to surmount this kind of scrutiny, and therefore Chinese companies looking elsewhere, particularly the European Union and other parts of the emerging market world, where they're going to place some outbound investment. But for the time being, I would say that Chinese investment into the United States is pretty much dead on arrival. That there is great benefit to the communities that are recipients of direct foreign investment, whether it's from China or whether it's from any country, that economic stimulus that will have great economic impact in the locations where these companies decide to locate, obviously creating a large number of jobs along the way. So we have always been an economy that has welcomed foreign direct investment wherever it came from. And certainly China has still being the recipient of a large amount of foreign direct investment. If I have my figures correct, last year over $60 billion of inflow of foreign direct investment went into China. So there has still been a steady stream of interest on the part of American companies and other foreign companies to continue investing in China because of the potential future opportunity as they see the Chinese marketplace potentially being the world's #1 consumer marketplace in the world.
Let me ask you about that, because I've talked to some business people who are involved in China, and they feel as though there's just nothing but chaos and they don't know which direction to move.
Corporations and business interests, their #1 concern is reliability and predictability. And when you have these kinds of effects due to policy measures such as tariffs, it does make certain companies have to rethink their longer-term plans as to whether or not they should diversify their supply chains into other destinations. We've seen from experience, based on various reports, that sometimes it's easier said than done, that a company such as Foxconn, yes, they can put a plant to make iPhones anywhere in the world. Yes, labor in Vietnam is cheaper, but there are other infrastructural requirements, including a very sophisticated supply chain that is highly embedded in China, where those parts, those piece parts that go into the iPhone might not be so easily sourced in a place like Vietnam. And so we are going to see probably emanate from Washington maybe stronger policy mandates that may require companies to, in a sense, diversify their supply chains. And I think you're going to see something done in the pharmaceutical arena that will require US-based pharmaceutical companies to make sure that their sources of supply are outside of China for both security purposes as well as for the maintenance of the US healthcare system. So I think we can expect to see more of that, perhaps formalized in the next sessions of Congress.
Even as the bilateral relationship deteriorates in other areas between the world's largest economies, 6 months after Chinese and American officials signed a trade deal, both nations met by video conference to review the progress of the agreement. It's interesting because we had this conversation between Vice Premier Liu He and the U.S. representative about where we're at in terms of trade between China and the United States. And all of this as a backdrop as the Republican National Convention was going on, and we kept hearing China virus and China this and China, kind of so much venom. And it seems like in some respects, the only light that we see right now, which is ironic in a way, and I want you to talk about this because that's where there was so much tension, was trade. It seems like it's the only kind of sliver of light we see between these two countries now where a dialogue's continuing.
Yes, I mean, just reflecting on the progress of the Phase 1 trade deal, it's always been 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And just based on the discussions that we've been observing, that it seems like China is trying to comply to the best extent possible the initial terms of the Phase 1 agreement. And most recently, we saw them step up their purchases of U.S. farm products, as well as a commitment to purchasing more U.S. energy products. So China does seem committed to seeing it through and not abandoning the trade deal or the first phase of this trade deal altogether. And if there's any bright spot, I would agree, Michael, with regard to U.S.-China relations, it's still at least the patient is still alive with regard to this issue of bilateral trade.
as long as there's a conversation going. And even after this conversation, we heard both sides, say it was positive or constructive. But where really are we in terms of trade? Because, and I ask that question based largely on the fact when you look at this administration, they're beset with problems. You have hundreds of thousands of people who've died of the virus. You've got racial unrest here in the United States. So domestically, this is a president who has a lot of problems leading up to November. Is there a possibility that opens up things in terms of perhaps moving forward with trade? Because the foreign policy wins seem more attainable than the domestic wins.
I mean, by and large, if you reflect on this current administration or any future administration, I think there's a high degree of agreement that there is no other relationship in the world that exists today that's more important than the trade relationship between the United States and China. And I think that's certainly reinforced by the fact that corporate America has a different point of view with regard to China. Yes, they want free trade as well as fair trade, and corporate America would like some of these issues addressed with regard to this topic of intellectual property transfer. But they're still very observant of the fact that even if you look at the pronouncements of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that China is an important marketplace for U.S. goods and services. And so there has to be a continuing dialogue because it's one of the most important, if not the most important, relationship that exists in the world today, the relationship between the United States and China. I think it's very clear that between the trade war as well as COVID, providing a 1-2 punch to the global economy, certainly with the United States, a 1-2 punch that it's going to take time to recover from. The U.S. economy in particular is in a comatose state. It is as a result of being, governmentally imposed restrictions on movement, on activity, as well as overall commercial activity, the economy taking a very massive hit. And as a result, surviving on the basis of fiscal stimulus, $5 trillion or more has already been injected into the U.S. economy to keep things alive. And how that's going to play out globally is also a very interesting thing because we're seeing a ripple effect all over the world. The EU, Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, all of those economies going into a significant decline as a result of both COVID and sort of the lockup of global trade.
I think you said the patient's still breathing. How do we get the patient well and out of bed? I mean, how do these two countries kind of come together? Because it's obvious that these two incredibly influential economies kind of are interconnected and depend on one another.
Unfortunately, I think the conversation with regard to U.S.-China trade is animated by the sort of decline and fallout of relations between the United States and China. What you're seeing emanate out of the executive office, be it a Democrat administration or even a Republican administration, is this growing sort of observation of a different China that the United States is confronting. And as a result of that, the United States, most recently starting with the Trump administration, breaking out a toolkit that was used during the Cold War against the Soviet Union, mainly using economic tools to counter or to challenge China and China's growth. And so what we're going to see, unfortunately, is that the United States is going to rely increasingly on these economic policies, economic tools, as a manner of, and again, in a sense, pushing back against and challenging China with regard to U.S. and U.S. interests around the world.
Today, I'm pleased to make a truly historic announcement in our battle against the China virus that will save countless lives.
As the U.S. struggles to combat a global pandemic that's killed nearly 200,000 Americans and left millions out of work, U.S. President Donald Trump has helped normalize anti-Asian xenophobia, stoking public hysteria and racist attacks like this one posted on social media.
This man had just assaulted me.
Arthur, we had a chance to talk about students, their experiences by being here in the United States. But a lot of students now are experiencing something we've never seen before, which is kind of the fallout from hearing China virus all the time. they've been targets. How difficult is that to see?
It's extremely difficult, Michael, and it's a really good question because we have a president that constantly reminds the American public on mainstream media, qualifying the virus as the China virus. No other leader in the world is doing this, and no other leader in the United States at a local level are using these kinds of expressions. Unfortunately, for those that are in a sense are disturbed in some way, they are targeting people who look Asian. Now, whether you are Chinese, whether you're Korean, whether you're Japanese, it doesn't matter. So oftentimes, unfortunately, I've had even my own personal experience that one of my students from China was assaulted by a deranged individual on the street. Unfortunately, we live in a society right now that having an Asian face, being of Asian background, automatically requires you to find ways and be aware of your surroundings in the event that somebody who is a little bit deranged may strike out, either verbally attack you or physically attack you. And that, I think, is the reality for many Asian Americans in America today.
From social distancing to deserted city streets, these are the images that capture a pivotal point in history as the world works to document the global coronavirus pandemic and its unique place in time. I've got one final question for you. Since you spend a lot of time teaching students, 10 years from now, because I think that's 10, 20 years is a good lens looking back, how will this period be viewed by economists, not just economic in terms of the trade war, but how the pandemic impacted the economy? How will it be framed?
I think it'll be framed as one of the most important historical milestones and events to hit both the United States and certainly occur worldwide. Certainly for this generation of students who are in school now, they'll never forget it. It'll be one of those sort of moments in history where you'll never forget where you were and what life was like in a lockdown condition. But I think it'll offer the world a lot of lessons. And so the important sort of benefit of the world and the United States going through this very, very bitter experience is the fact we will learn how to govern better. Governments around the world are going to take this very seriously. You're going to see increased amounts of investment in terms of contagion, public health, the development of mechanisms in our public health system to harden our public health system for the next pandemic. And from a policy perspective, we'll learn from the mistakes that were made. In other words, you may see in the Oval Office, or certainly at the executive level of every major government in the world, whether it's China, whether it's the United States or the EU, you're going to see probably a war room type of multi-agency approach and scenario planning. And so you're going to see more, probably a full-time staff devoted to events such as this and the controlling of pandemic. That includes not only an economic plan in place, includes a health system in place that makes sure that hospitals and healthcare providers have all the equipment necessary that's been in storage for immediate use. On the economic policy front, well thought out policy measures that at an instantaneous moment, yes, we can get checks and we can get money into the hands of those who have been economically displaced to save the economy and to save the lives of individual citizens. And so you're going to see, and the benefit is you're going to see better government as a result. That governments around the world are going to devote resources and people on a full-time basis and do scenario planning so that when the next pandemic occurs, and it will occur, that we will all be much better prepared. There's an old saying that was given to us by one of the greatest strategists of all time, Sun Tzu, and he says, you can't avoid the destruction of a hurricane, of a storm, but you can reduce the impact of a storm if you prepare for it. And so as a result of that, I think all governments are now attuned that we need better government, that we need better government preparation for the next event. and if you can minimize the impact of the next event, so long as you're prepared. And so that would be my final thought on that.
All right. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. It's always a pleasure.